Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a comparison of two recently released 50mm f1.4 options for the Sony FE platform. One of those, which was released first, was the Sigma 50mm f1.4 DN Art Series lens, followed just a couple of weeks later by Sony's own 50mm f1.4 G Master lens. Now, obviously, both of these lenses are going to be, of the available options on the platform, I think that these two are going to be the most widely compared and probably cross-shopped lenses. The price point isn't as radical as some other options, and both of them, I think, represent a premium option at a somewhat affordable price, though as we're going to see, that's more true of the Sigma than what it is of the Sony. So my purpose in this video is to try to give you a little bit of information to help you to make a more informed decision about which of these two should get your hard-earned cash. First of all, however, a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Ridge, the wallet redefined. Give your aching rear a break and ditch that bulky old wallet full of stuff you don't need and move to a sleek new Ridge wallet made of aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, or even specialty finishes like 18-karat gold or Damascus steel. It takes up little more room than a credit card, has RFID blocking technology to protect your valuable information, and comes with a lifetime warranty. Ridge wallets hold up to 12 cards, and you can customize them with the included cash strap or money clip. Check out their daily drive combos that pair a killer wallet with a matching key case that gives you similar minimalism for up to 6 of your keys. Visit ridgewallet.com/Dustin Abbott and use code Dustin Abbott to get 10% off your order plus free shipping worldwide.
So let's start by talking about some reasons to choose the Sigma, and the first is the most obvious of these, and that is the price. The Sigma came to market at a price point of $850 US, which I thought was a really competitive price point. I think Sigma probably knew that Sony was coming out with the 50mm f1.4 G Master, and so I think that they were maybe a little bit aggressive in their pricing to make it a more appealing option. And it certainly is when you consider that the Sony, though much more reasonable than the f1.2 G Master, which retailed at $2,000, this new f1.4 G Master is about $1,300 US. And so you're talking about a price point of $450 difference between the two, which is roughly a 50% increase. And I will note that I'm giving US dollar prices. I know that from the feedback from some of you, as well as my own research, that gap is even larger in some other markets where the Sony is priced considerably higher. And so thus the gap between the two lenses just grows at that point. And so, I mean, for many people, that may be the single most biggest consideration there is the cost of the two lenses. And Sigma certainly wins by a long shot if you use that margin. I'll also note that in many situations, the autofocus performance is essentially equal. Sigma has equipped this lens with their most recent focus system that really does have a lot of speed and makes it much more competitive with first-party GM options. And while the Sony has dual linear XD motors, I think that the gap between the two lenses is essentially non-existent for many practical purposes. We'll talk about one advantage that Sony has in just a moment, but in general, I would say that the performance is basically similar between the two. The same is true when you talk about the feature set. They basically have an identical feature set, and while I give that to Sigma as a win, is the fact that Sigma is offering basically all the same things as the G Master at a much lower price point. I did note in my tests side by side that the Sigma did offer a little bit better corner performance on the copies that I tested, and so if that is a priority for you, something to consider. The Sigma also exhibits a little bit better flare resistance, a little less open to flaring artifacts, ghosting artifacts, and so it gives you a little bit cleaner performance if you're shooting in a backlit situation. Now, maybe a little bit more of a subjective, but I do think that the Sigma design language is just a little bit cleaner and more elegant. In terms of how the lenses feel in the hand, the Sigma feels a little bit more robustly built, a little bit more metal, I should say, in the hand, and while the Sony feels a little bit more plasticky. And so that, again, if you care about those aesthetics, that might be a factor for you. So let's talk about some reasons to choose the Sony, things that stood out to me in my review of both lenses. The first of those is the fact that the Sony is significantly smaller. It's a full 15.5 millimeters shorter and weighs in at 150 grams less. That is enough to notice, particularly if you're going to shoot for longer periods. It means that the Sony can fit into a smaller case, for example, or maybe if you're bringing along multiple lenses, there'll be more room for those. So I think that that is going to be a real consideration if you want to travel small and light, as many of us do, including myself. It makes the Sony very attractive in that point. I'll also note that in terms of the basic design, that the Sony smaller size allowed it to move to a smaller filter size of just 67 millimeters. And why that matters is that 67 millimeters is not only a more common filter size, which means you're probably going to be able to share it amongst more lenses, but also it is shared with some other G Master lenses, including notably the 35mm and 24mm f1.4 G Master. It's very likely that someone that is shooting professionally would have one or maybe even both of those lenses also in their kit, and the ability to share filters across them could be a real-world consideration. There is also maybe a little bit more minor thing, but there is 2 versus 1 focus hold buttons on the Sony. And all that means is that if you're shooting in a portrait or vertical orientation, there's still going to be a focus hold button that is close to hand. Just, a minor ergonomic thing, but certainly is an advantage when you compare the two. Maybe even more important is that the fact that this is a first-party Sony lenses. I kind of hinted at this when talking about the Sigma and autofocus. There is an advantage baked in just because Sony does put a thumb on the scales when it comes to first-party performance. Namely, that on a body like my 30-frame Sony Alpha 1, I can get that 30 frames per second when shooting with the Sony lens. And so, for example, this shot of Nalo coming across the floor, I could just rack off those shots, and you can see autofocus and nailed as a part of it. But if I was shooting on the Sigma in the same situation, I would have a, yes, Sony imposed limitation of 15 frames per second. So that's only half, and of course if you're shooting on an A9 series body, that difference would be right now would be 15 frames versus 20 frames per second. So for many people, that's not going to be a consideration at all. But if you happen to shoot with one of the Sony sports-oriented body and you want to shoot at high-speed burst, there is a baked-in advantage. Another baked-in advantage is when it comes to focus breathing, as that while for video, both of them exhibit about equal amounts of focus breathing, the Sony lens would be compatible with Sony's focus breathing compensation, where the Sigma will not be. And that does make a real-world difference. Is it fair? Not really, but it is a reality when you are making a buying decision. I also felt that the Sony delivered more sharpness at f1.4, sharpness and contrast, and in my opinion, in the places where it mattered. Namely, in the center and the mid-frame, the Sony is the sharper of the two, very noticeably in the center of the frame, a little less notably in the mid-frame, but certainly better still. It also gave less fringing in similar situations. Now, it's not to say that it's totally free from any kind of longitudinal chromatic aberration, but certainly it is much better controlled. And that was a surprising weakness for the Sigma, in that some situations it did exhibit a fair bit of fringing, whereas the Sony is better controlled. I also noted that the Sony had both less distortion. Both of them exhibit pincushion distortion. However, the pincushion distortion on the Sigma lens was more pronounced, as is the vignette, which was about a full stop heavier in the corners. And so that is, again, a real-world consideration. Less to correct, ends up with a cleaner end result. I also found that I did prefer the overall rendering from the Sony. Now that's hard to quantify because it is truly an objective thing. And some of you really like the rendering from Sigma lenses, and I know that there are a number of you that find them to be a little bit more sterile and a little bit more flat when it comes to some of the rendering. It's very hard to define why and what that is, or even to demonstrate it in photos, but I would say on an instinctive level, I did slightly prefer photos taken with the Sony and just preferred the overall global rendering of the lens to that of the Sigma. Many of these things are marginal, and I will freely admit that. And so I think that probably the biggest advantage for the Sigma is the fact that it is so close to the GM in performance on so many levels and features, etc., things like that. But it does so at a much lower price. So my conclusion is, buy the Sigma if you want to save money. If you don't really mind a little bit more size and weight, that's not a deal breaker for you. And if you don't shoot with either, you don't shoot with one of Sony sports cameras, or you're not going to use a 50mm in that kind of situation, well, then you can save money and get a very, very good lens in the Sigma for much less money. Buy the Sony if you want a smaller and lighter lens with a slightly better optical performance and also full Sony support in these various ways that I've detailed. It's a difficult decision, but I think that there are some advantages going both directions depending on what your set of priorities are. And I hope that this video has helped you to maybe help to shape which one of these lenses better suits your own shooting needs. At the end of the day, it's your money, it's your decision, but I do hope that this helps you make the right decision. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full reviews of both lenses, also buying links for both lenses. You can follow me there on social media, get channel merchandise, become a patron. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching today. Have a great day, and let the light in.